Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Trump just met with Putin. Hillary Clinton is praising Trump's foreign policy. Ukraine is still losing. And European leaders, obedient and humiliated, groveled at the White House, begging for support from a man who openly mocks them. Sanctions have clearly failed. Arms control is dead. Multipolarity hasn't delivered. All while the genocide in Gaza drags on. What does this all mean for the global order? For Ukraine, for Palestine, and who's really winning? Joining me to unpack it all is historian, journalist, and director of the Tricontinental Institute, Vijay Prashad. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Vijay Prashad, welcome back to Dispatches.
I love being with you, Rania. Love it.
Well, I love having you, and there's so much to talk about. Lots of things that have been happening around the world, and it's been a while since I've had you on. And the thing that is dominating the news cycle at the moment is this very significant, first there was the Trump-Putin meeting that took place, then there was Zelensky and all the European leaders. So let's start with the Trump-Putin meeting. What's your analysis of what actually happened and what are the implications? Because, you know, there's been talk of, at least from the Trump side, of a ceasefire, right? But is the U.S. aiming for a real peace deal here, or just like a temporary pause to regroup? Or are they just kind of accepting that Russia can win, or like that Ukraine can't win? Tell me what your take is on everything that we've witnessed just with that, and then we can move to the sort of Zelensky European side of things.
Well, the first thing is that it actually happened. It actually happened. Trump and Putin met for the first time since 2018. It's also important that Putin came to the United States. I think that's a very significant point. Remember, when Russian troops entered Ukraine in 2022, the United States pushed the International Criminal Court to immediately or very quickly frame a warrant for the arrest of Vladimir Putin on the grounds that children had been moved from the war zone in Ukraine into Russia. That was the actual cause for the warrant. There's a living warrant for the arrest of Vladimir Putin, for which reason Mr. Putin hasn't traveled to many countries, didn't go to the BRICS summit in South Africa, didn't go to the BRICS summit in Brazil, hasn't been to many other international meetings and so on. He's had his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, go places. Well, they made a deal in advance that Mr. Putin could come to Alaska on US soil and not face any jeopardy. And I think that is really significant. I mean, when they began to discuss Mr. Putin coming to Alaska, I thought that must be already an indication that a lot has been discussed prior to the two of them meeting. You know, there's a lot of pre-agreements, one of them being we will not even seek to use the word arrest anywhere near Mr. Putin. It happened. They met. They seemed to have a pretty affable conversation. And I don't know if this was, became such a big deal in the United States, but I found this a pretty interesting moment that at the press conference, it was Mr. Putin that started it. It's on American soil, on US soil, and Mr. Putin starts the press conference. That's unusual. Generally, the host, in this case, the United States president, starts the press conference, but Mr. Putin started it. Now, this raises all kinds of questions, who played whom and so on. I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is effectively they have made some sort of understanding. They've, decided on certain things, which is to say, I think, and Mr. Trump has pretty much come out and said this, but nothing is exactly clear. They've decided that the land question is not going to be in doubt. In other words, the entire section that is now held by Russian troops from Crimea all the way up to the Donbass region, that area is not going to be negotiated away. In other words, Ukraine is not going to get that back. There may be some parts in northern Ukraine that will be swapped and so on, but not this part. And it seems pretty clear with Mr. Trump's statements that he has been saying, hey, listen, you need to have elections in Ukraine. This is interesting. So I think it's not, there was no big agreement. There was no big Alaska declaration or anything. It's pretty clear that the meeting happened. That was important. And I don't think that should be underestimated. And that they've made a bunch of side agreements on the irreducible minimum that Putin will, not want to negotiate on, that this is the bedrock, and that he's willing to come to the table with Zelensky to clear up other things, and the Europeans have to back off. I think that was the outcome of Alaska.
It's funny, with all the theatrics of everything, the sort of like conspiratorial minded people were like, that wasn't really Putin. That was a double. He would never come on American soil. And I'm just like, okay, maybe, but focus, people. I want to ask you, though, with regard to the European side of things, because the Europeans completely freaked out, right? They were not happy about this. They want the U.S. to continue to pour funding and weapons into this war, pour funding and weapons into NATO, which is interesting and ironic because when this started, it was really the U.S. pulling a lot of the Europeans in. In some cases, the Europeans were initially quite pro-diplomacy, and the U.S. was on the opposite end of things. But now it's like the sides have switched, and the Europeans are terrified the Americans are going to pull the plug. So you had them rushing to the White House for a meeting, what they called themselves the coalition of the willing. But Vijay, I'm going to show you a few tweets or a few photos of what this looked like. I mean, you actually shared one of them because it was kind of embarrassing. So here we go. We're going to look at a few photos of the Europeans coming to the White House to kiss Donald Trump's ring. Here is one photo where, in each one of these, they really look like school children, like surrounding their dear leader. This isn't actually the worst of it. It just looks kind of sad. You shared this one. This one looked very sad. This is like waiting outside the Oval Office. You said obedient Europeans.
But of course, this is AI generated, but it's
Oh,
no.
I didn't know. You're catching me. I had no idea. I thought it was real. And I'll tell you why, but go ahead.
It doesn't matter whether it's real or AI generated. The point is, this is a great photograph of how they behave. It's AI generated because Macron has 4 legs. You can see that he has 4 legs. Well, obviously he doesn't have 4 legs, but it's like a painting. It's a painting of the actual feelings of these people. It's not a photograph, but it's a painting. It's a courtroom. Yeah.
I want to show you why I thought it was real, because I want you to look at this one. Here they are. Yeah. They literally look like school children. Like this is actually, I believe, a real photo of them sitting.
This is real.
Yeah. And that's so, if you actually, like, that's why I saw the other one. I was like, oh, that must be real, because look at this. It really gives off the same vibes. But I guess I want your commentary. Explain what you meant when you said obedient Europeans. Like, what's going on here? Why is this so desperate and sad? What they call the coalition of the willing coming to basically grovel at the feet of a man who is relentlessly mocking them and wants to take their toys.
Well, there's a number of things to say. One of them is the name itself harkens back to the coalition of the willing for the illegal U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. But it was a term also used in Afghanistan, But really, George W. Bush pushed it for the Iraq war because he didn't have much of a coalition going into that illegal war. It was a term that comes from there, which means for an illegal war. But what's really interesting, particularly this photograph, what I find fascinating about it is if you look at Ms. Maloney, the Italian Prime Minister sitting next to Ursula von der Leyen toward the side, she looks disgruntled. And right through the meeting, she was rolling her eyes, she was not interested, and so on. She's the one who comes from the right. And I think she found the groveling, that's my interpretation, a little excessive. It's like, guys, you have
So she
no
has a little bit of
dignity.
dignity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you have no dignity. The Finnish President Stubb from Finland, started talking about 1944, which is interesting because Finland capitulated, actually didn't capitulate. Finland made an agreement with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to fight against the Soviets. It's only when the Soviets defeated the Nazi Finnish coalition that Finland switched sides, joined the Allied effort to go after the Nazis. But, he completely obscured that history, talking about 2025 is like 1944. Like what? Like an alliance with the Nazis against the Soviets? That's what you're promoting? I mean, these people understanding of history is so bizarre. But what I found fascinating and desperate amongst them is, look, you're right. The United States pushed Europe into this conflict. Europe was developing a relationship with Russia, was buying natural gas, became reliant on Russian natural gas, and so on, and didn't really want to escalate the Ukraine conflict. But I must say, it's not like they were innocent in it. They were playing a very, very dangerous, high-stakes game with the people of Ukraine. The Europeans were, in fact, playing the game with the people of Ukraine. Where is Boris Johnson today, Rania? Today, while we are talking, he's sitting in a beach in Greece while kids are dying, on the Ukrainian battlefield. He sent them to die. Now he's sunning himself, in Greece. I mean, these people are disgraceful, right? So they did play a high stakes game. It's not like they're innocent. But then the Europeans got themselves into a very difficult spot because somebody, blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Still don't know who it is officially. Yeah, somebody blew it up. Well, the beneficiary was the United States because the United States is now selling natural gas to Europe. Europeans are reliant on expensive US natural gas. The United States is turning around and say, you got to pay more on military and weapons and build up weapon systems. So they are basically destroying European social democracy. The European welfare state is being gutted. Energy prices gone up. You're going to spend more on the military. How are you going to, spend money on your schools and the little Scandinavian playgrounds and the drug rehabilitation centers? All of those little treats of European welfare, social, are going to be destroyed. And so the Europeans are sitting there in a way desperate, trying to get the United States and others, trying to get them to quote unquote behave themselves. Yeah, they are desperate, very much desperate in this, and that desperation comes out. I mean, they are sitting there with Trump saying, "Look, don't abandon us." And the question to ask the Europeans is, abandon you to whom? Because Mark Rutte is sitting at the other end of Giorgia Meloni, with his hand on his mouth. Abandon you to whom? And that's an interesting question. Abandon you to whom? Is, for instance, Russia going to invade and go all the way to Germany, to France? I don't think the Russians are interested in that, And so when they talk about security guarantees, there are some people saying, well, Russia next is going to take the Baltic states. Actually, I don't think they are interested in the Baltic states. I think they went in to protect Russian-speaking people in the eastern part of Ukraine who are being discriminated against by an Israeli-style Ukrainian supremacist set of laws. They went in to protect their naval base in Crimea, to build a land bridge from the eastern part of Ukraine. That was their aim. They went in to say, you can't join NATO. We don't want NATO short-range missiles sitting in Ukraine. But in fact, let's even think about the NATO issue. The Baltic states are in NATO. There could be short-range missiles there. The issue isn't that. The issue was protecting Russian nationals in Ukraine who were being discriminated against, and a military buildup by Ukraine to go and take over those sections of Ukraine which had declared themselves first autonomous and now to be part of Russia. That was the dispute. It was this Russian-speaking enclave, and it was the naval base. That's the dispute. I don't think Russia has ambitions to invade Berlin or to go all the way to Lisbon. So what security guarantees do the rest of Europe need? I think they are overplaying their fear of Russia, who was their very close friend until yesterday. They're going to live with Russia. They're going to have to live with Russia until the world is destroyed by a destroyed climate. They're going to have to live with Russia. That's a fact.
It's like they drank their own propaganda. They got high on their own supply in many ways because of exactly what you're talking about. And when you look at what's actually happened, I mean, Ukraine is not in a good situation at all. I mean, ultimately, the reason the U.S., I think, wants this war to come to an end is because they recognize that Russia, I mean, I don't know if the word winning is right. I guess if you want to use the word winning, it depends what winning means. But Russia's certainly not losing. And they could keep going. Ukraine is is basically they're losing more and more territory. And it seems like the longer this goes on, the more territory the Ukrainians will actually end up losing. They've lost so many people. They're struggling to maintain their troop levels. I mean, we've even seen them, having to recruit elderly people. So the state of the war is not looking good on the ground for the Ukrainians. So if it continues, actually, that kind of plays into Russia's favor, depending on, what it is you want out of this war. So it really is just amazing the way these European leaders, in the name of saving Europe, are just willing to lose this part of Europe to these Russians they're so terrified of. So I guess at the end of the day, I want to ask you, why is it, I guess, okay, fine, they've drinking their own Kool-Aid, but also, so one thing I want to say, Vijay, before I forget, to the idea that, Russia wants to take over all these Baltic states or something. It's like, really, you think Russia wants to have to pay all the welfare and pensions for all these people that even Europeans don't want to pay for anymore? But all that's to say, where does Zelensky fit into all of this? Because obviously he's really pushing for this to continue. And everybody was obsessed with the theatrics. They're like, oh my God, Zelensky wore a suit. But I'm curious, what should we actually be paying attention to here from the Zelensky front?
Well, look, Mr. Zelensky got elected on a peace platform to open doors to talk to Russia and so on. That fell apart pretty quickly. His term ended in May of 2024. Last I checked, we are in August 2025, which means his term ended in May last year. We are in August of this year. It's definitely over 1 year and several months. He has not had a mandate to be the president. They put off elections. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, the United States goes crazy about elections are not being conducted properly in Venezuela. Venezuela, under a real hybrid attack from the United States, still seems to be able to carry on its elections. Ukraine, they decided to postpone elections. He's in fact got no mandate officially. I understand that the parliament has basically said, let him continue. But look, parliaments do that. In India, the parliament did that. It's legal and illegal at the same time. Why couldn't they organize some kind of election? At any rate, that's not the main issue. The main issue is Trump has been saying, well, have an election, because they want Zelensky gone. I mean, it's very clear that Ukraine can't win this war. What does Ukraine winning this war mean? Well, it could mean two things. One, it could mean a complete rollback of Russian troops to January 2022, before the entry of Russian troops into the eastern provinces of Ukraine. That you could say that's winning, where they get their territory back. There is no way Russia is going to cede Crimea. I think Crimea from 2014 was gone, but Zelensky was asking for Crimea back. That's not going to happen. So number one is a rollback of Russia, at least to the January 2022 two positions, which I don't think is going to happen. The Ukrainians haven't been able to make that happen on the battlefield. The second one is the war aim that was put by Lloyd Austin, former defense secretary, in Kiev in 2022, when he, in the summer of 2022, said in the Ukrainian capital, we must weaken Russia. Well, it hasn't happened. Russia has not been weakened. In fact, in many regards, it has been strengthened. Its economy has withstood the sanctions. It has pivoted away from Europe to trade more within Asia, particularly with China, but also Central Asian countries and so on, including, of course, further south with India and other countries. That's made the United States apoplectic that the trade with India continues. So Russia hasn't been weakened. So none of the war aims have been met. Russia hasn't been weakened. Lloyd Austin was not able to achieve that war aim. And the territories after January 2022, when in February the Russian troops entered, those territories have not been recovered by Ukraine and most likely will not be, because several of that area have now voted to join Russia. So there has been some sort of mandate. Whatever you think about that mandate, that has happened. So they are not going to get that territory back. I don't think so. So in that case, there is no victory for Mr. Zelensky. You know, he is not going to be able to go to the Ukrainian people and say, I won against Russia. What he can say, which is, I think, also compelling, is that I was able to create enough European and US backing for us that we didn't lose even more territory. So we didn't lose worse because we are a small country. Russia is a big country. And so we didn't lose worse. But we had all these billions of dollars from the West. We were not able to get our land back. Mr. Zelensky is going to have to step aside. I think that's the general understanding. It's not going to be a Zelensky-Putin final agreement. It's going to be Putin and somebody else, I believe. And so that's why Trump is pushing for elections. The Europeans, on the other hand, if Mr. Zelensky stands away, are going to see this as an enormous defeat to their ability to get Zelensky to win. Because remember that these things become personalized. It's not Ukraine winning against Russia. It's Mr. Zelensky's dignity prevailing over Mr. Putin's dignity. And that's just not going to happen, because even Trump has now said, when Trump and Vance yelled at Zelensky, it was very clear they wanted him dismissed. And then he comes wearing a suit, carrying a letter for Mrs. Trump and so on, obsequious, seeking favor. But I think Trump has had it with him. He's been talking about elections, wants him out. So whatever happens, Rania, whatever happens, there will be no weakened Russia. There will be no defeated Russia. And I don't think the land transfers are going to go in the reverse direction.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like, if you really care about your people and your country, it just seems like the best thing to do would end the war sooner, because it's not working out in your favor. And the longer it goes on, the more you're going to lose, including people and potentially more territory. I did, however, and I mean, this is just pure speculation, but it makes sense. I did hear John Mearsheimer talking about this very issue and suggesting that this is one of those things that will just continue to be a conflict even at a low level in the future, because with those land transfers, whatever you want to call them, you're going to be having the NATO side, the Ukrainian side, the American side using that land that Russia will now have gained to cause interference within what would then be Russian territory. But I mean, all we can do is wait and see, I suppose. But, I wanted to ask you about sanctions here, because I think what's really interesting about what we've seen since 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and, Russia was already under sanction, but obviously they became probably one of the most sanctioned countries in the world by the West after this war kicked off. But sanctions clearly didn't work, right? They were supposed to isolate Russia and collapse its economy. And instead, Russia's economy seems to be doing fine. And also, a lot of those sanctions ended up boomeranging into consequences for European countries instead. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the economic warfare that didn't succeed in this, at least not so far.
I mean, look, let's also not minimize the difficulties that this posed to the Russians. The Russian economy, was in 2022 on a fairly big upswing. It was about 2.3 trillion was the size of it in 2022. Now it's about 2.17 trillion. So there's been some decline. It's not a huge decline, but there's been a decline. 2.17 is a pretty big size economy, 2.17 trillion. It's a big size economy. It has basically rebounded from several causes. One is you have military expenditure. Military spending goes up. That has a momentary multiplier effect. It has an impact. Trade with China is up, and it's trade that's not happening in dollars. It's trade that's happening in various goods and services. That the Russians are actually desperate to complete pipelines to supply China with energy, so that then the trade can balance out a little bit. Because right now, Russia is buying more from China than it is selling the Chinese, but they'll balance that out. Russia has all kinds of things that are useful for the big economies of Asia, rare earth metals and minerals and so on. So I think that, a couple of reasons why Russia was able to withstand the US sanctions shock. One is that they had already prepared for this. They had already moved a lot of their assets and they had prepared for sanctions. It's not like they were sitting around, waiting. It's the Russian oligarchs who had their money still sitting in Western banking systems that got them trapped. But the government economy had started to move. And secondly, Russia is a very large country, physically, geographically. And I don't know if you've seen this, but housing starts or new real estate construction is not happening in the European sector at the same rate as it's happening in the Asian sector. Now, some of this actually does have to do with climate change. As the climate begins to soften in the northern hemisphere, it's easier to live in Siberia. And people have been moving out there, where the trade and the business arrangements with China have been booming. So you are seeing actually just like in the United States, when people move to the Southwest, to Arizona and to New Mexico, and a lot of industry move from the Midwest there, you're seeing some movement of industry and service sector from the European sector out to the Asian part of Russia, north of China. And that has actually allowed the Russian economy some resilience. There's space to grow. If Russia didn't have this other dynamic economy next to it, it would have faced a serious problem. But, the Chinese motor is humming along perfectly fine, pulling along Southeast Asian countries, pulling along Russia.
It's also interesting because the U.S. kept threatening secondary sanctions. So I'm curious why you think that didn't seem to work to stop, countries, massive countries, like you mentioned, like China and India, from doing business with the Russians.
Well, look, firstly, all of this goes back to 2007, 2008, when the housing market in the US collapses. All these countries, particularly China and India, they just sort of, the coffee high disappears for a moment, and they're like, oh, wait a minute. This is a problem. We thought we would produce, refrigerators and internet goods and so on for the US European market forever. That's what we thought. We'll be supplying them forever. Now, suddenly, they don't have the capacity to buy the stuff we are making for their market. And that's the reason the BRICS first met, right? They meet to talk about more South-South trade. So the United States can now talk about as much secondary sanctions as it wants, but these countries have increased their trade with each other. They've increased their technology transfer amongst each other. The Chinese has developed technologies, some of it through technology transfer from Japan, from the United States, and so on. The Chinese now are transferring technology to Africa, to other parts of Southeast Asia, and so on. They don't really fear secondary sanctions like they used to. This is not to say that all sectors, say, of the Chinese economy or of the Vietnamese economy are completely oblivious to US sanctions. Some sectors are worried about it. In India, for instance, the pharmaceutical sector worries about secondary sanctions because they make a lot of money selling generic drugs to the United States. And so they would get hit hard by this. Some sectors feel the pain or have the fear. But in general, if you're supplying, say, military technology, you don't care about the United States. They're not buying your stuff. It's the Chinese are selling their military stuff to Pakistan, to Russia, whatever. They don't care. So some sectors don't care, some care for now. In general, these economies have enough space to survive right now because of that financial crisis and because of what it forced them to do after that. They have space to survive without the US market. So that's why, Marco Rubio and others were very careful to say, look, we can't sanction countries any longer. They don't use the dollar as much as they did, and they don't seem to be worried about market access.
So I guess this is where you see the consequences of multipolarity playing out. But of course, I think you just described a lot of ways that it does in terms of how it pushes back against U.S. empire. Not even like that's necessarily the whole point, but just that it gives that gives these countries more wiggle room, more space, other markets, other institutions internationally to collaborate with that are outside of the U.S. sphere of influence. That said, multipolarity has also shown to have extreme limits. And I think the most extreme example of that, and I can't, go an episode of my show without mentioning the elephant in the room, which is the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Gaza is still burning. And I think something on a lot of people's minds, and I know you did an episode recently with Amanda at the China Report, kind of talking about the China aspect of this, but in general, I think a lot of people, and I'll include myself in this, Vijay, because you and I used to have this conversation 2-3 years ago. And you always pushed back against me because I was like, no, multipolarity is like going to, win over the world. But ultimately what we've seen is multipolarity has not been enough to challenge this kind of US hyper-imperialist infrastructure, at least with regard to a Holocaust in Gaza. So I'm just curious, yes, there's benefits to multipolarity, but why is it still such a I guess, why are there still so many obstacles to this new multipolar world we've entered, stepping in to prevent the worst atrocity we've seen in our lifetimes?
Well, there's several things here. One of them is we're talking directly about Gaza, and we're talking about why haven't the BRICS countries done more? They've made verbal statements. They oppose the annexation. They oppose the war. Blah blah. Why haven't they done more? Well, there are two features to this. One is that it's not very well recognized that the U.S. government actually maintains an immense military or naval architecture in the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, it's important to know, and I have a list, so I'm even happy to read out the names of them. There are 5 U.S. destroyers sitting in the Eastern Mediterranean: the Hudna, the Burke, the Sullivans, the Austin, and the Ignatius. These are important destroyers by themselves. There's the Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group, which sits between Italy and Cyprus. What all of this does, these military presence of the United States, is they block the ability of any other country to send aid and relief to Gaza. Now, how do the little freedom flotillas get in? I don't think the US wants to be blocking those. I think they're quite happy to have the Israelis do that. You don't want to see a A-class destroyer coming, next to a little tiny boat and stopping it. But if the Chinese decide to send a ship in there, it's going to be really high tension at high seas. And I think the Chinese know that. Everybody knows that. United States would block any attempt by any other navy to enter that area. They will just block it because they'll say there are weapons on the ship. They're trying to, especially if it's an Iranian carrier or any carrier that has been in an Iranian port will not be permitted anywhere near Gaza, nowhere near. The Israelis will not permit it, but the US will stop it before it even comes near Israel. Everybody's aware of that, yeah? The Israelis have a complete US military shield around them. Talk about security guarantees. United States completely guarantees the security. So no country, no major BRICS or other country is going to militarily take on the United States on this. It's a horrible thing to say, but the Palestinians don't have, the BRICS cavalry coming in to save them. It hasn't happened, and it's not going to happen, unfortunately. There is no Arab cavalry that's coming to save the Palestinians either. The Egyptian military has been sitting in their bases. I don't know why they spend billions of dollars a year on really fancy American planes, and why they have tanks, and why they have trucks, and why they have the ability to create a no-fly zone. Why does the Egyptian military have the ability to create a humanitarian corridor? What's the point of wearing a uniform of the Egyptian military and just sitting at your base and watching the Palestinians be slaughtered? There's not even been a no-fly zone. So there is no Arab camp. If the Egyptians are not going to do it, nobody else can do it. I mean, you can't expect Algeria to send aircraft, across that without having to land somewhere. They just don't have the aircraft to do it, long-range aircraft. It's got to be the Egyptians. Nobody else can do it, and they're not going to do it. And then the final question is, why haven't these countries cut ties with Israel? Great question. Great question. I'm asking that question too. Why haven't they cut ties with Israel? To me, that's a no-brainer. Cut ties with Israel. Why not? I don't know why not, Rania. It infuriates me. I don't know why not.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very upsetting, because we're just helplessly watching people be starved to death and can't do anything about it because we're not countries. You and I don't have a military. You and I don't have the economy of a country that can impact Israel's economy by cutting trade ties. So those are all important points. I mean, what you mentioned about the Middle East is absolutely true. The Middle East is completely, or as you call it, West Asia, as we should be calling it, I suppose, is completely captured by U.S. imperialism. It's just one client state after another, and anything that wasn't fully a client state has very recently become one or is turning into one. You look at Syria. You look at what's happening in Lebanon right now, where the U.S. is pressuring the government to turn the Lebanese army into a tool against Hezbollah and essentially cause a civil war in this country. We'll see if that plays out, but it's quite a dangerous moment. And, I think, if you talk to people around here, Vijay, everyone just says we're basically living in greater Israel. There really is a sense of defeat. They've put in charge one country after another, the worst of us, to basically just sell everything out. And that's why you have an Egyptian government that will stand by and watch Gaza be slaughtered, in addition to a Saudi, an Emirati, and Bahraini, and a Jordanian government, and now a Syrian government that's watching its own territory be stripped away as they kill their own people. I mean, it's a horrific, horrific time. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sitting here saying, why aren't the BRICS countries forming a naval fleet, though I think they should, but why aren't they forming a naval fleet to go invade Israel and stop them? Not even asking that much. I think the question about trade relations, that's a very real, important question. Why have trade ties with Israel when they are the spear of U.S. empire, not just in this region, but in many ways around the world, and while they're starving people before our eyes? And it's just horrifying. And I hope if any of the governments of these countries are watching, you can email me an answer to my question, or go ahead and cut your trade ties, please. Thank you. But, on the note of Gaza, bringing it back to Russia, Ukraine, I think it's just unbelievably incredible that you have these European leaders who are just oh my God, what Russia's doing in Ukraine is so vicious and so evil, and they're killing civilians and blah, 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 blah. And I'm not denying that Russia's not bombing Ukraine. They are, and Ukraine's bombing Russia, and it's terrible. And definitely there's war crimes taking place and civilians are being killed, and it's terrible. Yes, but it is barely a tiny fraction of what the Europeans are backing in Gaza. And I just can't take any of these conversations seriously. I don't believe your tears. I don't believe your sympathy. I don't believe your concern, because you are perfectly fine with Israel wiping out Gaza, regardless of whatever BS, you're putting out every so often, so that 10 years from now, people can see that you tweeted one time that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is terrible. And I'm just curious your thoughts on that juxtaposition of just watching day after day babies be intentionally starved and bombed and everything around them destroyed, apocalypse, literally, worse and worse and worse, without a care in the world. And then we're supposed to sit here and believe you're so concerned about human rights and war crimes in Ukraine? Give me a break.
I mean, look, I'm obviously, the official number is over 62,000 dead in Gaza. That's the official number. But at the same time, the Israelis have been trying to wipe out Palestinian politics. I think it's important to recognize that Marwan Barghouti, the most popular leader of Fatah, of the largest, still the largest Palestinian, organization. Marwan Barghouti has been in an Israeli prison for 23 years and 4 months. Ahmad Sadat, the leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, has been in prison for 23 months and 23 years and 3 months, 1 month less than Marwan Barghouti. So these men, leaders of two very large, important groups in the Palestinian resistance movement, have been in prison for a quarter of a century. They've just been tortured, and recently the horrendous Israeli minister went into Marwan Barghouti's prison and taunted him on camera, and they posted that taunt. He's saying we'll kill everybody and so on. This is what Baruch Kimmerling, the Israeli political scientist, calls politicide. What the Israelis are doing is genocide, massacring, killing, rendering extinct Palestinian culture and so on, but they're also killing Palestinian politics. And in that, they are leaving the Palestinians without a leader. Whatever one thinks of Yasser Arafat, and Yasser Arafat in the end, surrendered to the Israelis with the Oslo Accords. But from 1964, when the Palestinian Liberation Organization was founded, until 1994, 30 years, Yasser Arafat was the reference of the Palestinian movement. You thought about Palestinian resistance, Arafat was the reference. Since Oslo, there has been no reference. There is nobody of the stature of Arafat. As I said, Marwan Barghouti in prison for a quarter of a century, almost the whole time since Oslo, since 2002, Second Intifada, he was arrested. Same with Ahmad Sadat. The Israelis simply have not allowed a Palestinian leader to emerge, to unite the Palestinians in the struggle. They're killing Palestinian politics, very little remarked. And how they're doing that is imprisoning thousands, tens of thousands of Palestinian political people in their prisons, killing them off in there, 300 or so killed off, starved. They've all got scabies and so on. Northern Israel, terrible conditions, not allowing human rights people to see them. In fact, criminalizing the solidarity groups like Adamir, like Al-Haq, and so on. The Israelis call them terrorist organizations. These are prisoner support organizations. The Palestinian Prisoner Society, criminalizing them for lifting up the banner of the Palestinian prisoners. So at the same time, as there's a genocide happening, there's also a politicide, the killing of Palestinian politics and the attack on Lebanon. I'd like people to recognize this. The wars on Lebanon since the invasion of 1982, the wars on Lebanon, you got to understand firstly that the Israelis are equipped with the best of the US fighter command. They have the 5th generation warfare. Everything is the best planes, the best radar systems, the best air to ground communications, the best missiles, and so on. The Lebanese Air Force has basically Cessna light aircraft and a few helicopters. I mean, it's Cessna light aircraft. There is no, they have Soviet era tanks. They have old UH-1 helicopters. You see them sitting at Beirut airport. Old UH-1 helicopters. They cannot defend themselves against the Israelis. So Israel is able to just fly into Lebanon and bomb, Hezbollah, bomb the Palestinians. Just pick off Palestinian resistance leaders as they are rising up. assassinate them, gang warfare inside Einl Helway camp and so on. They just don't allow particularly left leadership to emerge. They promote the Islamic right and then say, look at them, they're all fundamentalists. Well, why you got Ahmad Sadat in jail? Why do you keep arresting Khalida Jarrar? Why do you keep arresting the left-wing leaders and you allow, the Islamic leaders to stay free? And then you say, look, they are all terrorists, you got to kill them. I mean, this politicide has to be part of our thinking, because the Palestinians are struggling. And in this context, the 14-party negotiations that took place in China last year, very significant. First time since Oslo that both the Oslo signers and the rejectionists sat down in a big group. I mean, they were affirming the prisoners document, which was written by leaders of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and Fatah. All these prison leaders sat down and crafted a document in, I think, 2003 or 4 and released it saying we need a new political project. Well, the 14-party meeting in China picks that up 20 some years later and says, yes, we now have some kind of beginning of an agreement. I hope that continues, because what you need at the same time as stopping the genocide is starting Palestinian politics, a Palestinian political agenda put on the table. That's just not there now.
I mean, since you mentioned China, I'm just going to throw it out there in case the Chinese government is watching. Cut your trade ties, guys. Cut your trade ties. That would actually make a huge difference because China's economy is massive. And I think they're China's Israel's third largest trading partner. That's influence. Use it. I wanted to ask you, Vijay, about a recent interaction from one of our favorite people, both you and I. Her name is Hillary Clinton. She was recently on some podcast talking about how she feels about Donald Trump's foreign policy. So I want to play that clip, and then I want to get your reaction. All right, here it is. Oh God. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.